Long ago, Buddhist masters discovered something remarkable. True peace, they realized, was not something to achieve through struggle or effort. It was something already here, hiding in plain sight. Tonight, we will go on a journey through ancient Zen stories that remind us of this truth. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. These are not lessons to memorize or puzzles to solve. They are quiet doorways into understanding, each one offering a different glimpse of the peace that lives within you right now. The masters who first shared these stories knew that truth cannot be forced or grasped. So there is nothing you need to do except listen. So settle in now. Let your breathing slow and deepen. There is nowhere else you need to be. Relax. Take a slow, deep breath. And let's begin our journey together. In a distant kingdom where ancient wisdom was treasured, there lived a scholar named Deva who had spent 30 years studying every spiritual text he could find. His small room overflowed with old scrolls and books, each one carefully copied by hand and studied until the edges grew soft from handling. He could recite the Buddha's main teachings by heart, explain the most complex ideas about suffering and happiness, and debate meditation with anyone who would listen. Yet, despite all his knowledge, Deva found himself increasingly restless and unhappy. Sleep came fitfully, his mind churning through questions late into the night. During the day, he would sit quietly as the books instructed, but his thoughts raced like wild horses, jumping from one idea to another without ever finding peace. One morning, frustrated beyond measure, Deva decided to visit a famous monastery in the next valley, hoping that meeting with the wise monks there might finally unlock the understanding that seemed always to slip through his fingers. He packed his most treasured books into a leather bag and set out on the dusty road that wound through rice fields and small villages. The journey required crossing the wide river, where a simple ferryman named Kesh operated a small wooden boat. Kesh was weathered by decades of sun and wind, his hands rough from handling ropes and oars. He wore only a simple cloth wrapped around his waist, and his dark skin bore the deep tan of someone who had spent his entire life outdoors. As they pushed off from the muddy bank, Deva could not contain his excitement about his scholarly mission. He began telling the ferryman about his years of study, his vast collection of books, his ability to explain the most complex points of spiritual teaching. The words poured from him like water from a broken jar, each sentence revealing his pride in his learning. Kesh listened politely, his steady hands guiding the boat across the slow current. The morning air was thick with mist rising from the water, and occasional birds called from the reeds along the banks. When Deva finally paused for breath, the ferryman spoke quietly. "Master Scholar, you speak of many deep teachings. Tell me, what is the heart of all this wisdom you have gathered?" Deva straightened, pleased to have found someone interested in hearing his insights. "The Buddha taught that all suffering comes from not understanding," he began, his voice taking on the practiced tone of a teacher. "When we truly understand how life really works, when we see through our wrong ideas about ourselves and recognize that nothing lasts forever, then we can be free from endless worry and fear." He continued for several minutes, weaving together quotes from various teachings, explaining difficult terms, building a complex framework of ideas and concepts. The ferryman nodded respectfully throughout this talk, occasionally making soft sounds of understanding. When Deva finished, Kesh was quiet for a long moment. The boat drifted gently with the current as he seemed to consider the scholar's words carefully. Then, with the same calm tone he had used before, he asked a simple question. "And where is your suffering now?" The question hung in the air between them like morning mist. Deva opened his mouth to provide another learned response, then stopped. Something in the ferryman's simple words had created a strange stillness in his mind. For the first time in years, his thoughts were not racing ahead to the next idea, the next explanation, the next problem to solve. He looked around him as if seeing clearly for the first time. The gentle lapping of water against the boat's sides, the soft morning light filtering through the mist, the rhythm of his own breathing. The present moment, complete and whole, requiring no analysis or understanding. "I," Deva began, then fell silent. There was no suffering in this moment. There was only awareness, simple and direct, like the surface of the river reflecting the sky above, without effort or intention. Kesh smiled gently and returned his attention to guiding the boat. Sometimes, honored scholar, the mind that knows about the river and the mind that simply flows with the river are different streams altogether. They completed the crossing in peaceful silence. When they reached the far shore, Deva stepped onto the muddy bank and turned to pay the ferryman. But Kesh waved away his coins. "Your true payment," the ferryman said, "is already in your hands. You have been carrying it across every river you have ever crossed." As Deva walked away from the riverbank, his bag of books felt strangely light on his shoulder. The knowledge was still there, but it no longer seemed like a burden he carried or a treasure he possessed. It was simply part of the flowing stream of his experience, no more important than the feeling of dust beneath his feet or the warmth of sun on his face. That afternoon, instead of continuing to the monastery, he found himself sitting quietly under a great tree beside the road. His quiet time was different now. Instead of trying to use techniques or achieve special states of mind he had read about, he simply sat a day. His mind still produced thoughts, but they arose and passed away like clouds in an endless sky, neither grasped nor pushed away. When evening came, Deva realized he had been sitting for hours without feeling the need to move, without struggling with restlessness or sleepiness, without trying to be anywhere other than exactly where he was. The peace he had been seeking in thousands of books had been present all along, waiting patiently beneath the surface of his searching. In Zen Buddhism, this moment of recognition is called seeing directly into the mind. It is not something that can be learned from books or achieved through thinking hard. It is the immediate recognition of what is already present, like suddenly noticing that you have been breathing all along without thinking about it. The Buddha taught that suffering is created by our resistance to what is. When the mind is constantly analyzing, comparing, seeking to understand or improve the present moment, it creates a sense of separation from direct experience. We begin to live in our thoughts about life rather than in life itself. This does not mean that study and learning are useless. Deva's years of reading had prepared the ground of his understanding. But knowledge becomes wisdom only when it dissolves into direct experience, like salt dissolving into water. The ferryman Kesh understood something that no amount of reading could convey, that peace is not found in ideas about peace, but in the immediate recognition of what is already peaceful within us. Consider your own relationship with understanding. How often do you find yourself thinking about your experience rather than simply having it? How much energy goes into analyzing emotions rather than feeling them, planning for happiness rather than noticing the contentment that may already be present? The river in this story represents the natural flow of awareness itself. When we stop trying to direct this flow and simply allow ourselves to be carried by it, we discover that the very thing we were seeking was the awareness with which we were seeking. In the remote hills where prayer flags flutter in thin air and eagles soar between snow-capped peaks, there lived a weaver named Pema, whose skill with wool and silk was known throughout the region. Her fingers could coax the finest threads into patterns of such beauty that traveling merchants would journey for weeks just to see her work. Pema took great pride in her abilities. She would rise before dawn to begin her work, and often continue weaving by oil lamp until late into the night. Her small stone house was filled with examples of her artistry: wall hangings showing mountain landscapes, ceremonial robes for the local wise men, and carpets that seemed to glow with inner light. But as the years passed, Pema found herself growing increasingly worried about her reputation. When visitors came to see her work, she would watch their faces carefully, looking for any sign of disappointment or criticism. If someone praised another weaver in the valley, she would lie awake at night wondering if her own skills were getting worse. When young women came to learn from her, she found herself reluctant to share her best techniques, fearing they might one day surpass her abilities. This worry began to affect her work. Her hands would tremble slightly as she wove, knowing that each piece would be judged and compared to her previous efforts. The joy she had once found in the simple act of creating beautiful things was slowly being consumed by worry about how others would receive her creations. One autumn morning, as golden light streamed through her window and touched the half-finished tapestry on her loom, Pema received an unexpected visitor. An old woman appeared at her door, bent with age and carrying a walking stick worn smooth by countless miles of travel. Her clothes were simple and travel-stained, and she carried only a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. "I am Maya," the old woman said, her voice soft but clear. "I have traveled far to see the work of the famous weaver Pema. Would you honor me by showing me what you have created?" Pema felt the familiar flutter of nervousness in her chest, but she welcomed the visitor and began displaying her finest pieces. The old woman examined each one carefully, running her weathered fingers along the threads, holding the fabrics up to catch the light. She said very little, only nodding occasionally or making small sounds of interest. As the morning progressed, Pema found herself growing increasingly agitated by the woman's silence. Usually, visitors would exclaim over the beauty of her work, praising her skill and asking detailed questions about her techniques. This old woman seemed almost indifferent, as if she were looking at something else entirely. Finally, unable to contain her frustration, Pema asked directly, "Honored grandmother, what do you think of my work? Do you find it skillful? Does it please you?" Maya set down the piece she had been examining and looked at Pema with eyes that seemed ancient beyond her years. "Child," she said gently, "your work is indeed beautiful. Your skill is obvious to anyone who looks. But tell me, who is this weaver named Pema who is so concerned about what I think?" The question struck Pema like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Of course she knew who Pema was. "I am Pema," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, they sounded strange and hollow. "Yes," Maya nodded. "But who is this I that claims to be Pema? Can you show me this Pema? Is she in your hands that weave so skillfully? Is she in your eyes that see colors and patterns? Is she in your mind that worries about what others think?" Pema felt a strange confusion, like the feeling of waking from a vivid dream and not being sure which world was real. She looked at her hands, rough from years of working with wool and silk. Were these hands Pema? She noticed the thoughts arising in her mind, concerns about this conversation, memories of past praise and criticism. Were these thoughts Pema? "I don't understand," she whispered. Maya smiled with endless compassion. "Look very carefully, dear child. When you sit at your loom and become completely absorbed in your weaving, when your hands know exactly what to do without conscious direction, when the pattern emerges as if by itself, where is this Pema who worries about her reputation then?" As the old woman spoke, Pema remembered those precious moments when time seemed to disappear, when she and her work became one flowing process, when there was no sense of someone doing the weaving, only weaving happening. In those moments, there had been no worry, no self-consciousness, no fear of judgment. There had been only pure creative expression, like water flowing downhill or flowers opening to sunlight. In those moments, Maya continued, the most beautiful work emerges. Not because someone named Pema is trying to create beauty, but because beauty creates itself when the feeling of separation dissolves. The thread, the loom, the hands, the awareness that guides them all arise together as one flowing process. Pema sat in stunned silence as something fundamental shifted in her understanding. She began to see that her worry had been like a person afraid of their own shadow, running faster and faster to escape something that had no real existence. The old woman reached into her bundle and withdrew a small piece of fabric, woven with threads so fine they seemed to be made of light itself. The pattern was simple, just geometric shapes in natural colors, but there was something about it that took Pema's breath away. It seemed to embody perfect peace, as if the very process of its creation had been a deep meditation. "I wove this many years ago," Maya said, "when I finally understood that there was no weaver, only weaving. No artist, only art. No self to protect or promote, only the endless creativity of existence expressing itself through temporary forms." She placed the fabric in Pema's hands. The moment it touched her fingers, Pema felt a deep recognition, as if she were looking at something she had always known but forgotten. The worry that had plagued her for so long simply evaporated, like mist touched by morning Sunday. "But grandmother," Pema said, "if there is no self, no Pema who weaves, then what am I?" Maya's eyes twinkled with gentle humor. "You are the same thing you have always been, child. You are the awareness in which all experience arises. The thoughts calling themselves Pema, the hands that weave, the beauty that emerges from your work, the worry about reputation, the peace that comes when worry dissolves, all of this appears within the same vast, open space of knowing. This awareness is not yours," she continued. "It is what you are. Like the sky that remains unchanged whether it contains storms or sunshine, this awareness is unaffected by whatever thoughts or feelings pass through it. The person you thought you were is like a cloud in this sky, temporary and changing, while the sky itself is limitless and free." Pema spent the rest of that day with the old woman, not talking much, but sitting together in comfortable silence. As evening approached, Maya prepared to continue her journey. Before leaving, she gave Pema one final teaching. "Remember, dear one, that the goal is not to eliminate the sense of being Pema. That would be like trying to eliminate clouds from the sky. The clouds have their beauty and their purpose. The understanding is simply to recognize that you are the sky, not the cloud. From this recognition, even the cloud called Pema becomes light and playful, no longer a burden to be protected, but an expression of the same limitless creativity that weaves all of existence. After Maya left, Pema returned to her loom with a heart transformed. Her work became even more beautiful, but in a completely effortless way. There was no longer anyone there trying to create something impressive, only the natural intelligence of creation expressing itself through skilled hands and an open heart. Visitors still came to see her work, and she received their praise and criticism with equal calm. Like weather passing through an open window, their opinions touched her awareness, but did not stick or create trouble. She had discovered what Zen Buddhism calls seeing through the separate self, not the elimination of personality or individual expression, but the recognition that these are temporary patterns arising within an infinite field of awareness. This teaching about the separate self is one of the most profound insights of Buddhist wisdom. It does not mean that we cease to exist or that our individual lives don't matter. Rather, it means recognizing that what we truly are is far vaster and more free than the limited identity we usually take ourselves to be. Most of our suffering comes from trying to protect and promote a self that exists only in our imagination. We worry about our reputation, defend our opinions, and struggle to maintain an image of who we think we should be. But when we look closely, as Pema did, we discover that this solid sense of self is more like a rainbow, beautiful and vivid, but without substantial existence. In your own experience, notice how much mental energy goes into maintaining and defending your sense of self. How often do you feel hurt when someone doesn't appreciate your efforts? How much time is spent worrying about what others think of you? These are not character flaws, but natural results of identifying with something that seems solid, but is actually empty of independent existence. The Buddha taught that all phenomena, including our sense of personal identity, are empty of inherent existence. They arise through causes and conditions, like waves on the ocean, appearing separate but never actually divided from the whole. When this is truly understood, not just intellectually, but in the depths of our being, suffering becomes optional and peace becomes our natural state. As we settle deeper into tonight's journey through these ancient teachings, remember that you are not listening to these words so much as recognizing truth that has always been present within your own awareness. Like Pema discovering that she was the limitless sky rather than a temporary cloud, you may find that what you truly are is far more vast and peaceful than you ever imagined. Let these teachings work on you gently, like water slowly wearing smooth the edges of a stone. There is no need to grasp or struggle with understanding. Truth reveals itself naturally when we stop trying so hard to capture it, when we allow ourselves to rest in the simple awareness that is reading these words right now. In a valley nestled between two mountain ranges, where terraced fields climbed the hillsides like green steps toward the sky, there lived a village elder named Chen, who was known throughout the region for his wisdom and kindness. For 40 years, he had guided his community through good harvests and lean times, settled disputes with fairness, and helped families through their joys and sorrows. Chen took his responsibilities seriously, perhaps too seriously. He would rise each morning before the sun and walk through the village, checking on the elderly, observing the condition of the irrigation channels, and mentally noting what needed repair or attention. His mind was constantly occupied with plans for improving life in the village, ways to increase the harvest, and concerns about potential problems that might arise. The villagers loved and respected Chen, but they had begun to notice that their elder seemed to carry the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. His brow was often furrowed with worry, and he frequently spoke of the many things that could go wrong if people were not careful and prepared. One late summer afternoon, as Chen stood in his favorite spot overlooking the valley, dark clouds began gathering on the western horizon. The air grew still and heavy, and there was an electric feeling that made the hair on his arms stand up. His experienced eyes read the signs immediately. A massive storm was approaching, and it would likely bring hail that could destroy the rice crop just weeks before harvest. Chen's heart began to race. This was exactly the kind of disaster he had always feared. Months of careful planning, the village's entire food supply for the winter, the livelihood of dozens of families, all of it could be destroyed in a single afternoon. He ran through the village, shouting warnings and organizing people to cover what crops they could with whatever materials were available. But as the storm clouds grew darker and more ominous, Chen realized with growing despair that their efforts would not be enough. The storm was simply too large, too powerful. No amount of preparation or quick action could protect the vast fields of rice that stretched across the valley floor. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, Chen found himself standing alone in the middle of the village square, his fists clenched and raised toward the sky. This is not fair. He shouted at the approaching storm. These people have worked so hard. They deserve better than this. Thunder rumbled overhead as if in response to his challenge, and the rain began falling harder. Chen continued his futile argument with the storm, as if his decades of leadership had somehow given him the authority to negotiate with the weather itself. It was then that he noticed an old woman sitting peacefully on her porch nearby, calmly watching the storm approach. Her name was Li, and she was the oldest person in the village, well into her 80s. She had lived through more storms, droughts, floods, and disasters than anyone else, yet her weathered face showed no signs of distress or panic. "How can you just sit there?" Chen called to her, his voice barely audible over the increasing wind. "Don't you understand what this means? The crops will be destroyed." Old Li smiled gently and gestured for Chen to join her under the covered porch. Reluctantly, he ran over and sat beside her on a wooden bench worn smooth by decades of use. The rain was now falling in sheets, and hail had begun to pelt the ground with sharp, icy stones. "You are trying to hold back the ocean with your bare hands," Li said softly, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the noise of the storm. "Tell me, honored elder, in all your years of worrying about disasters that might come, how many of them have you actually prevented?" Chen opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He thought back through decades of sleepless nights spent worrying about drought, disease, accidents, conflicts with neighboring villages. How many of these feared disasters had actually occurred? Some, certainly. But how many had his worry prevented? If he was honest with himself, the answer was none. "The storm will do what storms do," Li continued, her voice carrying a strange peace that seemed to calm something deep in Chen's chest. "The crops will survive, or they will not. The village will adapt, as villages always have. Your worry adds nothing to our preparation and subtracts much from your peace." As if to emphasize her point, a particularly loud crash of thunder shook the ground beneath them. Chen instinctively tensed, then noticed that Li remained completely relaxed, as if she were listening to gentle music rather than the fury of nature. "But if I don't worry," Chen protested, "if I don't try to control and plan for everything, then who will? What will happen to the village?" Li turned to look at him with eyes that held the depth of someone who had seen the wheel of fortune turn many times. What happened to this village for the 500 years before you were born? What will happen to it for the 500 years after you are gone? The question struck Chen like a physical blow. In his desire to be a good leader, he had somehow convinced himself that the village's survival depended entirely on his constant vigilance and control. But of course, the village had existed long before him and would continue long after him. Generation after generation had faced storms, famines, wars, and countless other challenges, and somehow life had continued. As this realization settled into his awareness, Chen felt something loosen in his chest, as if a tight knot that had been there for years was finally beginning to unwind. He looked out at the storm raging across their valley and, for the first time, saw it simply as a storm. Not as a personal enemy or a test of his leadership, but as a natural force following its own ancient patterns. "What do I do then?" he asked quietly. "How do I care for the village without carrying this burden?" Li was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain drumming on the roof above them. "When you plant rice," she said finally, "you prepare the soil as best you can. You plant the seeds with care. You tend the young plants and keep the water channels clear. But you do not try to control the rain or command the Sunday. You do what is yours to do, then trust the larger forces to do what is theirs. The wise farmer plants in spring and harvests in autumn. He does not plant in winter because he wants rice sooner, and he does not skip autumn because he fears the work of harvesting. He works in harmony with forces much greater than himself." As Chen sat listening to these simple words, he felt a profound shift in his understanding. He had been trying to be responsible for things that were never his responsibility, while perhaps neglecting the things that truly were. His job was not to control the weather or guarantee perfect outcomes, but to prepare wisely and respond skillfully to whatever arose. The storm raged for another hour, then moved on as suddenly as it had arrived. When Chen and Li emerged from the porch, they discovered something remarkable. While some fields had indeed been damaged by hail, the majority of the rice crop had survived. The quick thinking and preparation of the villagers, combined with simple good fortune, had prevented the total disaster Chen had feared. But more importantly, Chen realized that even if the crop had been completely destroyed, the village would have found a way to survive and rebuild, just as it had countless times before. His worry and desperate attempts to control the uncontrollable had added nothing to their actual safety and had subtracted much from his own peace of mind. From that day forward, Chen continued to serve as the village elder, but with a completely different approach. He still planned carefully and prepared for difficulties, but he did so from a place of calm wisdom rather than anxious control. When problems arose that were beyond his power to fix, he met them with the same peaceful acceptance Li had shown during the storm. This transformation in Chen points to one of Zen Buddhism's most liberating teachings about the nature of control and surrender. The Buddha understood that suffering comes not from external circumstances themselves, but from our resistance to circumstances we cannot change. When we spend our energy fighting against forces much larger than ourselves, we exhaust our inner peace while accomplishing nothing of practical value. In Zen practice, we learn to distinguish clearly between what is ours to influence and what belongs to the larger flow of life. This is not about becoming passive or giving up all responsibility. Chen continued to fulfill his duties as village elder, but without the crushing weight of believing that every outcome depended on his perfect control. The Buddha taught that this kind of mental struggle is like a man shot by an arrow who refuses to have it removed until he knows who shot it, what kind of wood the arrow is made from, and why the archer chose to shoot him. While he demands answers to these questions, he continues to suffer from the wound that could be healed immediately. Similarly, while we demand that life conform to our preferences before we can be at peace, we continue to suffer unnecessarily from our resistance to what is already happening. This is one of the paradoxes that Zen Buddhism reveals. Surrender leads to greater power, not less. When we stop wasting energy on battles we cannot win, we have much more strength available for the work that actually makes a difference. When we stop demanding that reality be different before we can be peaceful, we discover reserves of calm wisdom that were always present but hidden beneath layers of struggle. The peace that Chen found during the storm is available to each of us in the midst of our own storms. It comes not from eliminating challenges from our lives, which is impossible, but from learning to meet challenges without the additional burden of resistance and complaint. This is the deep peace that Zen Buddhism offers, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of acceptance that allows us to respond to any difficulty with grace. In another village, many miles away where merchant caravans stopped to rest and trade, there lived a man named Rashid who had built a successful trading business through years of careful planning and hard work. His shop was filled with beautiful silks, precious spices, and crafted goods from distant lands. He owned several houses in the village and employed many people. But Rashid's success had come with an unexpected price. His mind had become like a merchant's ledger, constantly calculating, comparing, and keeping track of every small gain or loss. He would lie awake at night, thinking about business deals, worrying about competitors, and planning strategies to increase his wealth. Even during times of prosperity, he could not shake the feeling that he needed to work harder, acquire more, and prepare for potential disasters that might destroy everything he had built. Over the years, this constant mental activity had begun to feel like a great weight pressing down on his shoulders. His wife noticed that he smiled less frequently and seemed always distracted by some internal worry. His children had learned not to interrupt him when he was thinking about business, which was nearly all the time. One evening, as Rashid sat in his shop counting the day's earnings and planning the next day's activities, an old traveling monk appeared at his door. The monk's robes were faded and patched, and he carried nothing but a simple walking stick and a small bowl for receiving food. "Peace be with you, brother," the monk said in a gentle voice. "I am traveling to the monastery in the next valley and wonder if I might rest here for the night. I have no money to offer, but I can share some stories from my travels if you would welcome the company." Rashid looked up from his coins, annoyed at the interruption. His first impulse was to direct the monk to the public inn, but something in the old man's peaceful demeanor made him reconsider. Business had been good that day, and perhaps showing hospitality to a holy man would bring good fortune. "You are welcome to sleep in the back room," Rashid said somewhat grudgingly. "There is bread and tea in the kitchen." As the monk settled in for the evening, Rashid returned to his calculations. But he found himself distracted by the stranger's presence. There was something about the old man's complete contentment with his simple possessions that puzzled and slightly irritated the merchant. How could anyone be happy with so little? Didn't he worry about tomorrow? About security? About what would happen when he became too old to walk from village to village? Unable to concentrate on his business plans, Rashid eventually joined the monk in the kitchen, where the old man was sipping tea and gazing peacefully out the window at the stars. "You seem troubled, brother," the monk observed. "Your hospitality is generous, but I sense your mind is carrying a heavy burden." Despite himself, Rashid found the words spilling out of him. He told the monk about his business concerns, his worry about competition, his fear that all his success could disappear if he didn't remain constantly vigilant. He spoke of his desire to provide security for his family and his frustration that no amount of wealth ever seemed to be enough to guarantee that security. The monk listened with complete attention, nodding occasionally, but mostly just receiving Rashid's words with compassionate silence. When the merchant finally finished his long recital of worries, the monk was quiet for several moments. "Tell me," the monk said finally, "when you walk through the village carrying your heavy bags of goods to and from the market, do you also carry stones in your pockets?" Rashid looked confused. "Of course not. Why would I carry stones? They would only make my load heavier for no purpose." The monk smiled gently. "And yet, I notice you carry many stones in your mind. Worry about tomorrow's business, fear about last month's losses, concern about what your competitors might do, anxiety about disasters that may never happen. These mental stones add nothing of value to your life, yet they make every day's journey much heavier." The merchant sat in stunned silence as the truth of this observation penetrated his awareness. He had never thought of his constant worries as optional burdens, like stones he could choose to carry or leave behind. They felt so much like necessary parts of being responsible that he had never questioned their value. "But surely," Rashid protested, "a successful merchant must think ahead, must plan and prepare and worry about potential problems. How else can business succeed?" The monk nodded thoughtfully. "There is wisdom in planning and prudence in preparation. But tell me, when you lie awake at night worrying about a deal that might go wrong, does this worry make the deal more likely to succeed? When you spend your energy fearing that a competitor might undercut your prices, does this fear actually protect you from competition?" Rashid considered this carefully. When he was honest with himself, he had to admit that his sleepless nights of worry had never once prevented a business problem or created a successful outcome. The planning and preparation he did during working hours was indeed valuable, but the mental churning that continued during his rest time served no practical purpose. The mind that is constantly looking ahead to future problems or behind to past mistakes, the monk continued, cannot fully attend to present opportunities. Like a man trying to walk forward while looking over his shoulder, such a mind often stumbles over blessings that lie directly in its path. As if to illustrate this point, the monk gestured toward the window where a magnificent full moon had risen above the mountains, bathing the village in silver light. "How long has this moon been shining tonight while we have been sitting here talking?" Rashid realized with surprise that he had not once noticed the beautiful night sky, even though he had been sitting next to the window for nearly an hour. His mind had been so occupied with thoughts of business that he had missed the simple wonder of the present moment. "This is what I mean about mental stones," the monk said softly. "They take up so much space in our awareness that we have little room left for the gifts that each moment offers freely. The worries we carry achieve nothing practical, yet they steal our capacity for peace and joy." The merchant felt something shifting inside his chest, as if a tight fist that had been clenched for years was finally beginning to open. "But how does one set down these mental burdens?" he asked. "They feel so much a part of me that I cannot imagine my mind without them." The monk was silent for a long time, sipping his tea and gazing at the moonlit landscape. Finally, He spoke in a voice so quiet that Rashid had to lean forward to hear. When a merchant travels a mountain path carrying a heavy load, he does not try to throw away all his goods at once. He might die of cold without his blanket or starve without his food. Instead, he examines each item carefully. This tool is essential for his trade. This blanket provides necessary warmth. This decorative object is beautiful, but adds only weight to his journey. In the same way, we can examine each thought and worry that fills our mind. This planning session helps me prepare for tomorrow's work. This concern helps me care for my family's needs. But this endless mental rehearsal of disasters that may never happen, this constant comparison with other merchants' success, these add only weight to the journey without providing any benefit. Rashid spent the rest of that evening in deep conversation with the monk, learning to distinguish between useful planning and useless worry, between appropriate concern and mental stones that served no purpose. As the night progressed, he began to feel lighter, as if he were indeed setting down a heavy pack after a long day's journey. The next morning, the monk continued his travels toward the distant monastery. But his brief visit had planted seeds of understanding that would transform Rashid's entire approach to life and business. The merchant continued to plan carefully and work diligently, but he learned to do so without carrying the constant mental burden of worry and fear. His business actually became more successful, not less, because his mind was clearer and more present. He noticed opportunities that his previous anxious state had caused him to overlook. His relationships with family and customers improved because he was more attentive and less distracted by internal mental chatter. Most importantly, Rashid discovered that the security he had been seeking through endless accumulation and worry was actually found in learning to travel lightly through life, carrying only what was truly necessary and leaving behind the mental stones that had burdened his journey for so many years. The transformation in Rashid's life illustrates a fundamental insight of Zen Buddhism, that our thoughts about our problems often cause more suffering than the problems themselves. The Buddha taught extensively about this phenomenon, recognizing that the human mind has a tendency to take simple challenges and transform them into complex sources of ongoing distress through endless mental elaboration. In Zen practice, we learn to recognize this pattern and develop the skill of mental discernment. Not all thoughts that arise in the mind deserve our attention and energy. Some thoughts are like useful tools that help us navigate practical situations. Others are like the stones the monk described, adding weight without providing any benefit. The key is learning to observe our thoughts with gentle awareness rather than automatically believing and following every mental suggestion that arises. When you notice your mind beginning to spin stories about future disasters or past mistakes, you can ask yourself, is this thought helping me respond skillfully to a present situation, or is it just adding unnecessary weight to my mental load? This insight is central to Buddhist psychology and the path to deep peace that these teachings offer. The Buddha observed that human beings create most of their own suffering through mental habits that seem protective but actually increase distress. Learning to identify and release these habits is like learning to travel through life with a much lighter pack. The freedom that comes from this kind of mental housekeeping is one of the great gifts of Zen Buddhism. It offers practical wisdom for reducing unnecessary suffering while maintaining appropriate engagement with life's genuine challenges. When we learn to travel lightly through our days, carrying only the thoughts and concerns that actually contribute to skillful living, we discover reserves of peace and energy that were always available but hidden beneath layers of mental clutter. This is the deep peace that these ancient teachings point toward, not the peace of having no problems, but the peace of meeting problems without the additional weight of mental resistance and elaboration. In this lightness of being, we find that life's inevitable challenges can be navigated with grace, wisdom, and even moments of joy that would be impossible when the mind is burdened with unnecessary stones. High in the mountains, where ancient temples clung to misty peaks like birds' nests on cliffsides, there lived a young monk named Jiro, who had been given the sacred duty of ringing the temple bells. Each day at dawn, noon, and dusk, he would climb the wooden steps to the bell tower and strike the great bronze bell with a heavy wooden mallet, sending its deep voice rolling across the valleys below. For the first few months of his appointment, Jiro took great pride in his responsibility. The bell was magnificent, cast centuries ago by master craftsmen and decorated with intricate designs of dragons and lotus flowers. Its sound was so pure and resonant that people in villages miles away would pause in their work when they heard it, using its call to mark the rhythm of their days. But as weeks turned to months, the daily routine began to feel monotonous to Jiro. Ring the bell at dawn, ring it at noon, ring it at dusk. The same wooden steps, the same bronze surface, the same deep tone echoing across the same valleys. His mind started to wander during the bell-ringing ceremony, thinking about his studies, his family back home, or his hopes of one day becoming a respected teacher. Sometimes he would realize he had finished ringing the bell without even noticing he had begun. His body had performed the familiar motions while his mind was completely elsewhere, lost in memories of the past or dreams about the future. The bell still sounded at the proper times, but Jiro felt increasingly disconnected from the sacred act he was performing. This absent-minded approach began to show in his work. Occasionally he would arrive at the bell tower a few minutes late because he had been distracted by other thoughts. Sometimes he would strike the bell with less care, producing a sound that was technically adequate but lacked the clear, penetrating quality that the bell was capable of producing. One evening, as autumn light faded behind the mountain peaks and Jiro prepared for the sunset bell ringing, he discovered that the head monk, Master Kenji, was waiting for him in the bell tower. The old teacher sat quietly on a wooden bench, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed in peaceful meditation. "Master," Jiro said, bowing respectfully, "I did not expect to find you here." Master Kenji opened his eyes slowly and smiled with gentle warmth. "I have come to listen to the evening bell. It has been many months since I truly heard it." Jiro felt a flush of embarrassment, wondering if the master had noticed his recent carelessness. He picked up the wooden mallet with extra attention, determined to ring the bell perfectly in the presence of his teacher. As he raised the mallet to strike the bronze surface, Master Kenji spoke quietly. "Before you ring the bell, tell me what you are thinking about." The question caught Jiro off guard. His mind had been occupied with worry about impressing the master, mixed with thoughts about his evening meal and some books he wanted to read later. "I am thinking about ringing the bell properly, master." "And what else?" Kenji asked gently. Jiro hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I am thinking about whether you are judging my performance. I am wondering what we will have for dinner. I am remembering a conversation I had yesterday with another monk. I am planning what I will study tonight." Master Kenji nodded with understanding rather than criticism. "And where is the bell in all of these thoughts?" The question struck Jiro like a physical blow. He looked at the great bronze bell hanging silently before him and realized that despite standing next to it with mallet in hand, the bell itself had been completely absent from his awareness. His mind had been so busy with other concerns that he had no room left for the very thing he was supposed to be honoring with his complete attention. "The bell is not in my thoughts at all," Jiro admitted quietly. "Then how can you truly ring it?" Master Kenji asked. "How can you honor this sacred instrument if you are not present with it? How can you create the sound that the villagers depend on if your mind is somewhere else entirely?" The master stood and approached the bell, running his weathered hand along its decorated surface with obvious reverence. This bell was cast by artisans who devoted months of their lives to creating something worthy of calling people to prayer. The bronze was mined by workers who spent days in dark tunnels. The designs were carved by craftsmen who poured their artistic skill into every detail. Generations of monks have struck this bell with complete attention, understanding that each ring was a prayer, a blessing, a moment of sacred connection between earth and sky. "When you ring this bell while thinking about dinner," Kenji continued, "you are not really ringing it at all. You are making noise while your attention is elsewhere. The bell deserves better. The villages that depend on its call deserve better. And you deserve the peace that comes from being fully present with your sacred work." Jiro felt tears begin to well in his eyes as he understood the depth of what he had been missing. He had been treating his bell ringing as a chore to get through rather than an opportunity for spiritual practice and service to others. "Master, how do I learn to be truly present with the bell?" Kenji smiled and gestured toward the bronze surface. "Begin now. Before you strike, spend a moment really looking at the bell. Notice its color, its weight, the way the evening light plays across its surface. Feel the mallet in your hands, the smoothness of the wood, the balance of its weight. Listen to the silence that exists before sound begins." Following his teacher's guidance, Jiro set down his racing thoughts and brought his complete attention to what was actually present in that moment. He saw the bell as if for the first time, noticing details in its decorative dragons that he had never observed despite looking at them hundreds of times. He felt the wooden mallet's grain against his palms and noticed the way its weight distributed through his hands and arms. "Now," Master Kenji said softly, "ring the bell from presence, not from habit." When Jiro struck the bronze surface with his full attention engaged, something miraculous happened. The sound that emerged was deeper, clearer, and more resonant than any he had ever produced. It seemed to arise not just from the bell, but from the complete attention he had brought to the moment. The tone rolled across the valleys below with a quality of presence that seemed to carry peace to everyone who heard it. As the sound faded into silence, Jiro stood in wonder at what he had experienced. The same bell, the same mallet, the same tower, but everything had been transformed by the quality of attention he had brought to the simple act of creating sound. "This is the difference," Master Kenji said quietly, "between doing something and being present while doing it. The first accomplishes the task. The second transforms both the task and the person performing it into something sacred." From that evening forward, Jiro's approach to his bell-ringing duties was completely transformed. Each time he climbed the wooden steps to the tower, he would pause and bring his scattered thoughts back to the present moment. He would notice the feeling of his feet on the steps, the sound of birds in the nearby trees, the quality of light at that particular time of day. Before striking the bell, he would take a moment to appreciate its beauty and honor the centuries of craftsmanship that had created it. He would feel the weight and texture of the mallet and listen to the silence that would soon be filled with sound. When he finally struck the bronze surface, it was with his complete attention and gratitude for the privilege of creating something beautiful. The change in Jiro's presence became obvious to everyone in the monastery. The sound of his bell ringing had a quality of peace and clarity that seemed to bless everyone who heard it. Visitors to the temple would comment on how the bell calls seemed to create a sense of calm that lasted long after the sound had faded. Other monks began asking Jiro to teach them about his approach to mindful attention. Most importantly, Jiro discovered that the presence he cultivated during bell ringing began to extend into every other area of his life. When he swept the temple floors, he was fully present with the broom and the dust and the rhythm of cleaning. When he studied ancient texts, he was completely absorbed in understanding the teachings rather than thinking about other things. When he ate his meals, he tasted his food with full attention rather than consuming it absent-mindedly. This story reveals one of Zen Buddhism's most fundamental teachings about the nature of presence and awakening. The Buddha understood that most human suffering comes from our inability to be fully present with our actual experience. Instead of living our lives directly, we live in our thoughts about our lives, constantly pulled away from the richness of the present moment by mental commentary, planning, worry, and distraction. In Zen practice, we learn that presence is both the path and the destination. When we bring complete attention to whatever we are doing, even the most ordinary activities become opportunities for peace, insight, and connection. Washing dishes with full attention becomes a meditation. Walking down a familiar street with complete presence reveals details and beauty that distracted awareness never notices. The Buddha taught that mindfulness, or present moment awareness, is the foundation of all spiritual development. Without the ability to be fully present with our experience, we cannot develop genuine wisdom about the nature of mind and reality. We cannot cultivate authentic compassion because we are not truly present with other people's suffering. We cannot find lasting peace because we are always mentally somewhere else, chasing after conditions that we imagine will finally make us happy. But when we learn to be fully present, as Jiro did with his bell, we discover that each moment contains everything we have been seeking. The peace we thought we would find in future accomplishments is available right now in wholehearted engagement with present activities. The satisfaction we imagined would come from external achievements is actually found in the quality of attention we bring to whatever we are doing. This does not mean that goals and planning become unimportant, but that they are held lightly rather than becoming obsessions that steal our attention from present experience. Jiro continued to improve his skills as a monk and eventually became a respected teacher, but his success came through presence rather than anxious striving. In a prosperous city where merchants traded silk and spices from distant lands, there lived a judge named Master Wei, who was known throughout the region for his strict adherence to the law and his swift, decisive punishments. For 15 years, he had presided over the central courthouse, where citizens brought their disputes and criminals faced justice for their wrongdoings. Wei took great pride in his reputation for fairness and consistency. He studied the legal codes carefully, weighed evidence thoroughly, and delivered judgments without favoritism or emotion. Rich and poor received equal treatment under his careful application of the law. Merchants respected his decisions in business disputes, and families trusted him to settle inheritance matters fairly. Yet, for all his dedication to justice, Wei found himself growing increasingly bitter and weary as the years passed. Each day brought a parade of human weakness and wrongdoing through his courthouse. thieves who stole from honest workers, merchants who cheated their customers, family members who fought over money, neighbors who couldn't resolve simple disagreements without involving the courts. The steady stream of human failings had gradually hardened Wei's heart. He began to see people primarily as collections of their worst actions rather than as complex beings with their own struggles and circumstances. A man who stole bread became simply a thief. A woman who lied to protect her family became a liar. A young person who fought in anger became a troublemaker. This hardened perspective extended beyond the courthouse into Wei's personal life. He found himself judging everyone he encountered, from servants in his household to fellow officials in the government. His conversations became filled with criticism and complaints about the moral failings he observed in others. Friends began to avoid him, finding his constant negativity exhausting and depressing. One autumn morning, as Wei walked to the courthouse through the busy market streets, he witnessed a scene that filled him with familiar irritation. A young man was running frantically through the crowd, pushing past people and knocking over baskets of fruit and vegetables. Merchants shouted angrily as their goods scattered across the dusty ground. Wei's immediate reaction was disgust at this obvious display of selfishness and disrespect. Here was yet another example of the thoughtless behavior that plagued society. The young man clearly had no consideration for others, no respect for people's hard work, no sense of responsibility for the damage he was causing. But as Wei prepared to summon the city guards to arrest the troublemaker, an elderly street sweeper who had been quietly cleaning nearby approached him with urgent words. "Honorable Judge," the old man said breathlessly, "that young man is not causing trouble for its own sake. His wife has gone into labor with their first child, but there are complications. The midwife sent him running to fetch the physician who lives on the other side of the market. He fears for both his wife's life and his unborn child's." Wei stopped in his tracks, his anger suddenly replaced by confusion. The same actions he had interpreted as selfish rudeness were actually desperate attempts to save lives. The young man wasn't thoughtlessly destroying property. He was racing through an obstacle course of market stalls to reach help for his family. "How do you know this?" Wei asked the street sweeper. The old man smiled gently. "I have been cleaning these streets for 40 years, honored judge. I have learned to watch and listen before I judge. This young man ran past me earlier, calling out his wife's name and praying to the Buddha for help. His face shows love and terror, not anger or selfishness." As Wei watched the young man disappear around a corner, still running desperately toward the physician's house, he felt something crack open in his chest. For years, he had been observing human behavior from the elevated position of his judge's seat, seeing only the surface actions without understanding the stories beneath them. "Old father," Wei said quietly, "you see more clearly from street level than I do from my high bench." The street sweeper leaned on his broom and looked at Wei with eyes that held decades of patient observation. "Perhaps, honored judge, but you have a more difficult task than I do. I only need to understand what I see. You must decide what to do about it." That simple statement haunted Wei for the rest of the day. As he sat in his courthouse hearing various cases, he found himself wondering about the stories behind each person's actions. What circumstances had led the accused thief to take food? What pressures had caused the merchant to bend the truth? What pain might be driving the family members who fought so bitterly over their inheritance? This new way of seeing began with small observations. Wei noticed that the man accused of stealing grain had thin children and desperate eyes. The woman who had lied about a debt had bruises on her arms that suggested trouble at home. The young people involved in a fight were from different parts of the city where tensions had been growing over limited work opportunities. None of these observations excused the illegal behavior, but they revealed it as part of larger human stories filled with complexity, suffering, and difficult choices. Wei began to see that his role as a judge was not simply to punish wrongdoing, but to understand the conditions that created wrongdoing and respond in ways that might address deeper problems. That evening, Wei sought out the old street sweeper and found him finishing his work as the sun set behind the market stalls. "Old father," Wei said, bowing respectfully, "I have been thinking about your words all day. How do you maintain such patience and understanding when you see so much human folly and weakness?" The street sweeper set down his broom and gestured for Wei to sit with him on a stone bench near a small shrine dedicated to the Buddha's compassion. Oil lamps flickered in the growing darkness, and the sounds of the market settling into evening quiet surrounded them. "Many years ago," the old man said, "I was much like you are now. I saw people's mistakes and failures, and I judged them harshly. I believed that my ability to see their faults made me superior to them. What changed?" Wei asked. The street sweeper was quiet for a long moment, watching the lamp flames dance in the gentle breeze. "One winter night, I saw a woman stealing bread from a baker's stall. My first thought was to call for the guards, but something made me follow her instead. She took the bread to a small hut at the edge of the city where she lived with her elderly mother and 3 young children. The mother was ill, the children were thin with hunger, and the woman herself looked as if she had not eaten in days. She broke the stolen bread into small pieces and gave it all to her family, keeping none for herself. As I watched through the window, I realized that I had been seeing her action as theft, but she was seeing it as the only way to keep her family alive. Both views were true, but mine was incomplete. I was judging her from the comfort of my own security without understanding her impossible situation." Wei felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he understood the implications of this teaching. "What did you do?" "I left money outside her door that night, enough to buy food for several days. But more importantly, I began to see every person I encountered as someone with their own story, their own struggles, their own reasons for doing things I might not understand." The old man turned to look directly at Wei with compassion that held no trace of judgment. "This does not mean excusing harmful behavior or abandoning the need for justice. But it means recognizing that understanding must come before judgment, and compassion must guide whatever actions we take." Over the following months, Wei's approach to his judicial duties was completely transformed. He began asking different questions during court proceedings, seeking to understand not just what people had done, but why they had done it and what circumstances had shaped their choices. This deeper inquiry revealed patterns Wei had never noticed before. Many thefts were driven by desperate poverty that could be addressed through community assistance. Many conflicts arose from misunderstandings that could be resolved through patient dialogue. Many harmful behaviors were expressions of pain or fear that could be healed through compassion rather than punishment alone. Wei's sentences became less about punishment and more about restoration and healing. When possible, he directed offenders toward assistance, education, or community service that addressed underlying problems. He worked with local officials to improve conditions that contributed to crime and conflict. Most remarkably, the crime rate in Wei's jurisdiction began to decline significantly. When people felt understood rather than simply condemned, they were more likely to accept responsibility for their actions and make genuine efforts to change. When underlying problems were addressed, the behaviors that stemmed from them naturally decreased. The transformation in Wei's judicial practice points to one of Zen Buddhism's most profound teachings about the nature of compassion and understanding. The Buddha taught that true wisdom comes not from judging others, but from understanding the conditions that shape all human behavior, including our own. When we see someone acting in ways we disapprove of, our immediate reaction is often to label them as bad, selfish, or wrong. But this quick judgment prevents us from seeing the fuller picture of their situation. Like Wei watching the young man run through the market, we observe the surface behavior without understanding the deeper story that gives it meaning. In Zen practice, this quality of understanding is called seeing with compassionate eyes. It means looking at others the way we would want to be looked at when we are at our worst, with awareness of the full complexity of human experience rather than quick judgments based on limited information. Think about times when you have been misunderstood by others who judged your actions without knowing your circumstances. Perhaps you were short-tempered with someone because you were dealing with stress they knew nothing about. Maybe you made a mistake at work because you were distracted by personal problems. In those moments, you likely wished that others could see beyond your behavior to understand the fuller context of your situation. The Buddha taught that all beings want to be happy and free from suffering, just as we do. When people act in harmful ways, they are usually trying to meet legitimate needs or escape genuine pain, but doing so through methods that don't work or that create additional problems. Understanding this doesn't excuse their behavior, but it opens possibilities for responses that address underlying needs rather than simply opposing surface actions. In the mountain village where mist clung to terraced fields like silk scarves hung out to dry, there lived a woman named Li Mei, who was known throughout the region for her remarkable capacity to forgive. No matter how badly people treated her, no matter what disappointments or betrayals she experienced, she seemed to maintain a heart that held no bitterness or resentment. This unusual quality had been tested many times throughout Li Mei's life. Her first husband had left her and their young son to pursue a merchant's life in the city, never returning and leaving her to raise their child alone. Her brother had borrowed most of her savings to start a business, then lost the money through poor decisions and never repaid her. Several people she had helped generously during difficult times had turned against her when village politics became complicated. Yet through all these disappointments, Li Mei continued to treat everyone with kindness and respect. She spoke well of people who had hurt her, helped those who had been ungrateful for her previous assistance, and maintained friendships with those who had gossiped about her behind her back. This behavior puzzled many people in the village. Some admired her for what they saw as remarkable strength of character. Others wondered if she was simply weak or foolish, allowing people to take advantage of her generosity without consequences. A few even suspected that her forgiveness was insincere, a way of maintaining a good reputation while secretly holding grudges. The mystery of Li Mei's unusual capacity for forgiveness deepened when her grown son, Chen, made a decision that shocked everyone who knew the family. After years of Li Mei's patient support through his education and early career, Chen announced that he was moving to the distant capital city to pursue opportunities that would likely mean he would rarely return home. What made this decision particularly painful was that Li Mei had recently been diagnosed with a serious illness that would require ongoing care and support. Chen knew about his mother's condition, but he chose to pursue his own ambitions rather than stay to help her through her illness. The village expected Li Mei to be devastated, angry, or at least deeply disappointed in her son's apparent selfishness. Instead, Li Mei helped Chen pack his belongings, gave him what money she could spare for his journey, and sent him off with her blessing. When concerned neighbors asked how she could support his decision to abandon her in her time of need, she simply said, "A parent's love does not depend on a child's choices. My happiness for his success is not diminished by my sadness at his absence." This response finally prompted one of the village elders, an old teacher named Master Huang, who had observed Li Mei's unusual behavior for many years, to approach her directly with his curiosity. "Sister Li Mei," he said one afternoon as she tended her small garden despite her increasing weakness from illness, "I have watched you for decades, and I confess I do not understand the source of your remarkable forgiveness. Others in your situation would be bitter, angry, or at least deeply hurt. Yet you seem to maintain genuine peace and kindness toward everyone, including those who have caused you pain. What is the secret of this capacity?" Li Mei set down her gardening tools and invited Master Huang to sit with her on a wooden bench in the shade of an old plum tree. For a long moment, she was quiet, as if considering how to explain something that had become as natural to her as breathing. "Honored teacher," she said finally, "may I tell you about something that happened to me many years ago when my son was still small?" Master Huang nodded, settling in to listen carefully. "I was walking to the market one morning, carrying Chen on my back because he was too young to walk the full distance. The path was muddy from recent rains, and I was being very careful with each step to avoid slipping. As I rounded a corner, a man coming from the opposite direction bumped into me hard, nearly knocking both Chen and me into the mud. My first reaction was anger," Li Mei continued. "I thought, how rude and careless. Can't he see I'm carrying a child?" I was about to speak sharply to him when I noticed something that changed everything. "What did you notice?" Master Huang asked. The man was blind. He was using a walking stick to feel his way along the path, but the recent rain had created new puddles and obstacles that confused his usual route. When he bumped into me, he was as startled as I was. He immediately apologized profusely and asked if we were hurt. His face showed genuine concern and embarrassment, not carelessness or rudeness. Li Mei paused to watch a bird land in the plum tree above them, its song clear and sweet in the afternoon air. "In that moment," she continued, "I realized that I had been ready to judge and blame someone for an accident that hurt no one, caused by a difficulty I had not even noticed. If I had spoken angrily to him, I would have added unnecessary pain to his already challenging day. More than that, my anger would have been based on a complete misunderstanding of the situation." Master Huang listened with growing understanding, but remained curious about how this single incident could have shaped Li Mei's entire approach to forgiveness. "This experience taught me to ask a different question when people hurt or disappoint me," Li Mei explained. "Instead of asking, 'Why are they treating me this way?' I learned to ask, 'What am I not seeing about their situation?' Instead of assuming their actions were directed at me personally, I began to wonder what difficulties or pain might be influencing their behavior." "So when your husband left, what did you not see?" Master Huang asked gently. Li Mei smiled sadly, but without bitterness. "I realized that his decision to leave was not really about me, or even about our son. It was about his own fear of responsibility, his panic about being trapped in a life that felt too small for his dreams, his inability to communicate his feelings directly. He was running from his own limitations, not rejecting us personally. And your brother who lost your money? His poor business decisions came from desperation to prove himself successful, combined with inexperience and perhaps some bad advice. He was trying to solve his own feelings of inadequacy, not trying to hurt me. The loss of the money was a consequence of his poor judgment, but it was not an intentional betrayal. And now your son's decision to move away when you need care? Li Mei was quiet for a long moment, her eyes reflecting deep sadness mixed with understanding. Chen is young and afraid. He sees my illness and feels helpless, overwhelmed by the thought of watching me decline. His leaving is not indifference to my suffering, but his own way of trying to escape feelings he doesn't know how to handle. He believes that if he builds a successful career, he can somehow compensate for not being here during my illness. Master Huang sat in amazed silence as he absorbed the depth of Li Mei's insight. But sister, does this understanding not sometimes excuse behavior that causes real harm? Should there be no consequences for choices that hurt others? Li Mei nodded thoughtfully. Understanding does not mean excusing or accepting harmful behavior without question. If my husband had wanted to return, we would have needed to address the problems that caused him to leave in the first place. If my brother asks to borrow money again, I would need to consider whether doing so would truly help him or enable him to avoid learning from his mistakes. But understanding does free me from carrying anger and resentment that would only add to the suffering already present in these situations. When I understand that people's hurtful actions usually stem from their own pain or limitations rather than malice toward me, I can respond from wisdom and compassion rather than from wounded pride or desire for revenge. Most importantly, she continued, this understanding allows me to love people despite their mistakes and limitations, just as I hope to be loved despite my own. We are all doing the best we can with the understanding, resources, and emotional capabilities we have at any given moment. Sometimes our best is not very good, but it is still our best. The conversation with Master Huang took place just months before Li Mei's illness progressed beyond her ability to care for herself. Word of her condition eventually reached Chen in the distant capital, and he returned home filled with guilt and regret about his decision to leave. He expected to find his mother angry or hurt by his absence during her greatest time of need. Instead, Li Mei welcomed him with the same unconditional love she had always shown, helping him understand that love does not keep a record of mistakes or require payment for forgiveness. She spent her final weeks teaching him the same wisdom about compassion and understanding that had shaped her own life, ensuring that her capacity for forgiveness would continue through him long after she was gone. Li Mei's story reveals one of the deepest teachings about compassion in Zen Buddhism. The Buddha understood that forgiveness is not primarily about other people's behavior, but about freeing ourselves from the burden of carrying resentment and anger. When we truly understand the conditions that shape everyone's actions, including our own, forgiveness becomes a natural response rather than a difficult spiritual achievement. Most of us have been taught to think about forgiveness as something we do for other people, a kind of gift we give to those who have wronged us. But Li Mei discovered that forgiveness is actually something we do for ourselves, a way of releasing the mental and emotional weight of holding grudges and nursing wounds. The key insight in her approach was recognizing that most harmful behavior stems from pain, fear, confusion, or limitation rather than malice. When someone hurts us, they are usually trying to meet their own legitimate needs or avoid their own suffering, but doing so in ways that don't work or that create additional problems. The Buddha taught that holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. Li Mei had learned to set down the coal, not because the other person deserved her forgiveness, but because she deserved the peace that comes from not carrying hot coals around in her heart. The deep peace that these teachings offer comes not from eliminating difficult people from our lives, which is often impossible, but from learning to meet difficulty with understanding rather than reactive anger. In this understanding, we find that forgiveness is not a burden we must carry, but a freedom we can claim, releasing ourselves from the prison of resentment to discover the natural compassion that was always available beneath our wounded pride. In a bustling trading city where caravans arrived daily from distant kingdoms carrying precious goods, there lived a silk merchant named Han who had built his entire identity around his success in business. For 20 years, he had carefully cultivated relationships with the finest silk weavers, developed an eye for quality that was respected throughout the region, and accumulated wealth that allowed him to live comfortably and support his extended family. Han's shop was filled with bolts of silk in every imaginable color and texture. Customers came from neighboring cities specifically to see his collection, knowing that Han's silk was always of the highest quality and his prices were fair. He took deep pride in his reputation and worked tirelessly to maintain the standards that had made his business successful. But Han's prosperity had come with an unexpected burden. Over the years, his sense of worth had become completely tied to his business success. When sales were good, he felt happy and confident. When business was slow, he became anxious and depressed. He would lie awake at night worrying about competition from other merchants, changes in trade routes that might affect his supply, or economic conditions that could reduce demand for luxury goods. His wife noticed that Han could no longer enjoy simple pleasures without connecting them to his business concerns. Even during family celebrations, part of his mind was always calculating profits, planning future purchases, or worrying about potential problems. His happiness had become completely dependent on external circumstances that he could not fully control. One autumn, Han made his largest investment ever, using most of his savings to purchase an enormous shipment of the finest silk from a master weaver known throughout the kingdom for his artistry. The silk was extraordinarily beautiful, woven with threads so fine they seemed to capture light itself. Han was confident that this investment would establish him as the premier silk merchant in the entire region. The shipment was traveling by caravan across the desert, a journey that typically took 3 weeks. Han spent those weeks in a state of excited anticipation, planning how he would display the silk, calculating the profits he would make, and imagining the admiration his customers would express when they saw such magnificent goods. But the caravan never arrived. Word came through desert travelers that the caravan had been caught in an unexpected sandstorm of unusual severity. While the people had survived by taking shelter, all the goods had been destroyed by the driving sand and fierce winds. Han's entire investment was lost completely. When Han received this news, he felt as if the ground beneath his feet had given way. Not only had he lost his life savings, but his reputation as a successful merchant was now in question. His shop looked sparse with so much of his inventory gone. Customers began going to other merchants who still had extensive stock. Suppliers became reluctant to extend credit to someone who had suffered such a massive loss. Within a matter of weeks, Han went from being one of the most successful merchants in the city to struggling to keep his business doors open. The comfortable life he had built over 20 years seemed to be crumbling around him. He fell into deep despair, unable to sleep or eat properly, consumed by anger at the unfairness of losing everything to a freak weather event completely beyond his control. His wife watched with growing concern as Han withdrew from family and friends, spending his days sitting in his nearly empty shop, staring at the few remaining bolts of silk and rehearsing the story of his loss over and over in his mind. She tried to comfort him by pointing out that they still had their health, their family, and their home, but Han could only see what he had lost. One morning, as Han sat in his shop feeling sorry for himself, an old beggar appeared at his door, asking for water. The man was clearly very poor, wearing patched clothes and carrying only a small bundle of possessions. But his face held a quality of contentment that puzzled Han. Here was someone who had nothing, yet he seemed more at peace than Han had felt even during his most prosperous times. "Uncle," Han said as he gave the man water, "forgive my curiosity, but you seem remarkably cheerful for someone in your circumstances. How do you maintain such contentment when you have so little?" The beggar smiled and settled himself comfortably on the ground outside Han's shop, as if he had all the time in the world for conversation. "Brother merchant, may I ask you something in return? You have a shop, a roof over your head, and enough to eat, yet your face shows more suffering than mine. What is the source of your great unhappiness?" Han found himself pouring out the whole story of his lost shipment, his financial ruin, and his fears about the future. The beggar listened with complete attention, occasionally nodding with understanding. When Han finished his tale of woe, the old man was quiet for several moments, gazing thoughtfully at the few bolts of silk still displayed in the shop. "Tell me, brother," the beggar said finally, "before you made this large investment, were you happy with your life?" Han considered the question. "I was comfortable. My business was steady, my family was well cared for. I suppose I was reasonably content. And what was different then from now, besides the silk that was lost in the storm?" Han looked around his shop, then at his hands, then back at the beggar with growing confusion. "I'm not sure I understand your question." The old man's eyes held a gentle wisdom that reminded Han of his grandfather, who had died when Han was still a young man. "Before the storm, you had a certain amount of silk, a certain amount of money, a certain reputation. Today, you have less silk, less money, and perhaps a different reputation. But you still have hands that can work, eyes that can judge quality, relationships with suppliers and customers built over 20 years. You still have a family who loves you, and a mind capable of building another business. The storm took your silk," the beggar continued, "but did it take your knowledge? Did it take your skills? Did it take your ability to start again?" Han opened his mouth to protest that starting again was impossible at his age, with his debts, in his circumstances. But as he began to speak, he realized that the old man's questions were revealing something important about the nature of his suffering. "The silk that was lost," the beggar said gently, "was it ever truly yours to begin with?" The question struck Han like a physical blow. He had never thought about ownership in these terms. "I paid for it. It was legally mine." "Yes, but did you create the silkworms that produced the threads? Did you grow the mulberry trees that fed them? Did you spin the silk or weave the fabric? Did you control the weather that destroyed it?" Han sat in stunned silence as he began to understand what the old man was pointing toward. "We spend our lives," the beggar continued, "claiming ownership of things that flow through our experience temporarily, like water flowing through our cupped hands. When the water flows onward, as water must, we suffer as if something that truly belonged to us has been stolen. But if we never really owned the water in the first place, then what exactly have we lost?" Over the following hours, the beggar helped Han examine his assumptions about success, failure, and the source of happiness. Through patient questioning, he guided Han to see that his suffering was not actually caused by losing the silk, but by his attachment to an identity that depended on external circumstances remaining stable. Before this loss, the old man asked, when your business was successful, were you truly happy? Or were you constantly worried about maintaining that success? Han realized with shock that even during his most prosperous times, he had been anxious about losing what he had gained. His success had not brought lasting contentment, but rather a constant fear of failure. The loss of his silk had simply made visible the anxiety that had always been present beneath his apparent prosperity. Then perhaps, the beggar suggested, this storm has given you an unexpected gift. It has shown you that the happiness you were seeking through external success was never actually there. Now you have the opportunity to discover a different kind of contentment, one that doesn't depend on circumstances staying the same. The conversation with the beggar marked the beginning of Han's complete transformation. Instead of clinging to his old identity as a successful silk merchant, he began to see himself simply as someone who understood silk and could help connect beautiful fabrics with people who appreciated them. This shift in perspective changed everything about how he approached rebuilding his business. Instead of desperately trying to recover his former status, he started small and focused on serving his customers well without attachment to specific outcomes. Instead of worrying constantly about competition and market conditions, he did his work wholeheartedly and accepted whatever results arose naturally. Gradually, Han's business did recover, but his relationship to success was completely different. When sales were good, he was grateful but not proud. When business was slow, he was patient but not worried. He had learned to hold his work lightly, engaging fully without being attached to particular results. Most importantly, Han discovered a quality of inner peace that had nothing to do with external circumstances. Whether his shop was full of the finest silks or nearly empty, whether customers praised him or criticized him, whether his profits were high or low, he maintained an underlying contentment that came from understanding the temporary nature of all conditions. This story points to one of Zen Buddhism's most fundamental insights about the nature of suffering and attachment. The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of all suffering, not because caring about things is wrong, but because clinging to outcomes we cannot control creates inevitable disappointment and anxiety. Han's suffering was not actually caused by the sandstorm that destroyed his silk. Natural disasters happen, business investments sometimes fail, and external circumstances change constantly regardless of our preferences. His real suffering came from having tied his sense of identity and worth to conditions that were inherently unstable and beyond his ultimate control. This is the trap of attachment that Buddhist teaching reveals. We invest our sense of security and happiness in things that are temporary by nature, then experience loss and anxiety when they inevitably change. It's like building a house on shifting sand and then being surprised when the foundation becomes unstable. Material possessions will come and go, circumstances will rise and fall, reputation will shift with the winds of fortune, but the peace that arises from understanding impermanence becomes the one treasure that no external storm can ever destroy. By the shores of a peaceful lake where morning mist rose like incense from the still water, there lived a fisherman named Tao who had practiced his craft for most of his adult life. Each day before dawn, he would push his small wooden boat into the calm water and spend the morning hours casting his nets in the quiet solitude that he had always treasured. For many years, Tao found deep satisfaction in his simple life. His catches were usually adequate to feed his family and sell a few fish in the village market. He knew every curve of the shoreline, every seasonal pattern of the fish, every subtle change in weather that might affect his success. His wants were modest, and his life felt complete in its simplicity. Tao particularly enjoyed the peaceful rhythm of his mornings on the water. The gentle splash of his oars, the soft sound of his nets entering the lake, the sight of birds beginning their day among the reeds. Fishing was not just his livelihood but his meditation, a time of harmony with the natural world that brought him a deep sense of contentment. This peaceful existence changed dramatically when a new fisherman named Wei moved to the village and began fishing the same lake. Wei was younger than Tao, with innovative techniques and equipment that Tao had never seen before. He used different types of nets, fished in different areas of the lake, and seemed to have an almost magical ability to locate schools of fish. At first, Tao was merely curious about the newcomer's methods. But as weeks passed, it became impossible to ignore that Wei was consistently catching much larger amounts of fish than Tao had ever managed. Other villagers began commenting on Wei's remarkable success, praising his skill and modern approaches to fishing. Slowly, Tao's contentment began to erode. He found himself watching Wei's boat from a distance, trying to figure out his techniques. He started counting Wei's catch and comparing it to his own daily results. For the first time in his life, his own adequate catches began to feel insufficient and disappointing. The peaceful mornings that Tao had always treasured became sources of anxiety and self-doubt. Instead of enjoying the sunrise and the gentle movement of his boat on the water, he spent his fishing time worrying about whether he was using the right techniques, fishing in the right locations, or measuring up to the standards that Wei seemed to set effortlessly. Tao's wife noticed that her husband was becoming increasingly irritable and unhappy. He would return from fishing with a dark mood even on days when his catch was perfectly adequate by their previous standards. He complained constantly about Wei's unfair advantages and wondered aloud whether his own traditional methods were outdated and inferior. What made Tao's situation even more painful was that his actual circumstances had not changed at all. His catches were still adequate to meet his family's needs. His knowledge of the lake was still valuable and effective. His boats and nets were still functional. The only thing that had changed was his awareness of someone else's greater success, yet this knowledge had transformed his entire experience of his work and his life. The situation reached a crisis point one morning when Tao noticed that Wei was fishing in an area of the lake that Tao had always considered his special spot. This location had been Tao's favorite for years, a quiet cove where he often had his best luck and enjoyed the most beautiful views of the surrounding mountains. Tao felt a surge of anger and resentment that surprised him with its intensity. Not only was Wei catching more fish, but now he was encroaching on Tao's territory. All the peace and joy that Tao had once found in fishing seemed to have been stolen by this younger, more successful competitor. As Tao sat in his boat, seething with frustration and watching Wei cast his nets in the beloved cove, an old hermit who lived in a small hut near the lake shore called out to him from the bank. "Friend Tao," the hermit said, "you seem troubled this morning. The fish have not changed. The lake has not changed. Your boat and nets have not changed. What is different?" Tao paddled over to the shore and climbed out of his boat, grateful for someone to talk to about his frustrations. "Old uncle, a new fisherman has come to our lake, and his catches put mine to shame. I feel like everything I thought I knew about fishing is worthless compared to his modern methods." The hermit, whose name was Lao, had lived by the lake for many decades and was known in the village for his quiet wisdom and peaceful demeanor. He invited Tao to sit with him on a smooth rock near the water's edge. "Tell me, brother Tao," Lao said gently, "before this new fisherman arrived, how did you feel about your life?" Tao thought back to those mornings just a few months earlier when he had pushed his boat into the lake with eager anticipation for the day ahead. "I was happy. I loved the peaceful mornings, the feeling of working with my hands, the satisfaction of providing for my family. Fishing felt like a form of prayer, a way of connecting with the natural rhythm of life." "And has the lake forgotten how to give you fish?" Lao asked. "No, my catches are about the same as they always were." "Has your family's need for fish increased?" "No, we still need the same amount of food as before." "Has your knowledge of this lake suddenly become useless?" Tao paused, realizing that his decades of experience were still valuable, still effective in their own way. "No, I still know things about this lake that no one else knows." Lao smiled gently and picked up a small stone from the shoreline. "Tell me, brother, is this stone beautiful?" Tao looked at the stone, which was smooth and grey with interesting patterns created by years of water erosion. "Yes, it has a quiet beauty." Lao reached down and picked up another stone, this one larger and more dramatically colored with streaks of red and gold. "And is this stone beautiful?" "Yes, that one is beautiful too, but in a different way." "Now," Lao said, holding both stones in his palms, "does the beauty of the second stone make the first stone ugly?" The question hung in the air between them like morning mist. Tao stared at the two stones and suddenly understood something profound about the nature of comparison and the source of his suffering. "No," he said quietly. "Each stone has its own beauty. The second stone doesn't take anything away from the first." "And does Wei's success as a fisherman take anything away from your own skills and knowledge?" Lao asked. Tao felt something shift deep in his understanding. "No, it doesn't. His success doesn't diminish what I know or what I can do. It doesn't change the fact that my methods work well for me and my family's needs." "Then where does your unhappiness come from?" the hermit asked with infinite patience. From comparison, Tao realized with growing clarity. From measuring my life against his instead of appreciating it for what it is. From thinking that his way of fishing somehow makes my way wrong or insufficient. Lao nodded with approval. "The mind that compares is like a person who looks at the moon and feels sad because it is not the Sunday. Both the moon and sun have their own light, their own beauty, their own purpose in the natural order. Neither needs to be like the other to be perfect exactly as it is." The conversation with the hermit marked a turning point in Tao's understanding of his situation. He realized that his suffering had nothing to do with Wei's fishing techniques or success, and everything to do with his own habit of measuring his worth against external standards rather than finding satisfaction in his own authentic relationship with his work. Over the following weeks, Tao practiced returning his attention to the aspects of fishing that had always brought him joy. Instead of watching Wei's boat and counting his catches, Tao focused on the feeling of his own boat moving through the water, the satisfaction of his nets filling with fish, the beauty of sunrise over the familiar lake. He discovered that when he stopped comparing his experience to Wei's, the peaceful contentment he had always found in fishing returned naturally. His catches remained adequate for his needs, his family remained well fed, and his mornings on the lake became once again a source of meditation and connection with the natural world. Most remarkably, when Tao released his resentment and comparison, he found that he could actually appreciate Wei's skills without feeling diminished by them. He even began to enjoy occasional conversations with the younger fishermen, learning some new techniques while sharing his own deep knowledge of the lake's patterns and seasons. Tao's story reveals another crucial aspect of how we create unnecessary suffering through mental habits that seem natural but actually work against our well-being. The Buddha taught extensively about the painful trap of comparison and the way it destroys our ability to appreciate what we actually have. Before Wei arrived, Tao's fishing provided everything he needed: adequate income, peaceful solitude, satisfying work, and a sense of connection with nature. None of these genuine benefits disappeared when Wei began fishing the same lake. But Tao's awareness of someone else's greater success made his own perfectly adequate situation feel insufficient and disappointing. The hermit's teaching about the two stones points to a fundamental truth about the nature of value and beauty. In the natural world, diversity is not competition, but harmony. Different flowers don't compete to be the most beautiful flower. Each expresses its own unique form of beauty. Different birds don't try to sing like other species. Each contributes its own voice to the chorus of the forest. The peace that Tao rediscovered came from returning his attention to his own authentic relationship with his work, rather than viewing it through the lens of comparison. This is available to all of us when we remember that our worth is not determined by how we measure against others, but by how fully we engage with our own unique circumstances and opportunities. In Zen practice, this understanding is called just this, the ability to be completely present with our own experience without needing it to be different or better than someone else's experience. In this presence, we discover that the peace we thought we would find through external achievement or competitive advantage is actually available right now through accepting and appreciating what is already here. The illusion of suffering dissolves when we see clearly that pain comes from external circumstances, but suffering comes from our resistance to those circumstances and our attachment to things being different than they are. When we stop feeding the mental habits that create unnecessary suffering, what remains is our natural capacity for contentment, wisdom, and peace that doesn't depend on anything external staying the same. In a quiet valley where cherry trees bloomed each spring like clouds of pink snow, there lived a carpenter named Kenji who had spent 40 years working with his hands to create beautiful and useful things from wood. His workshop was a simple building behind his modest home, filled with tools that he had collected and cared for throughout his long career. Kenji's tools were not the finest or most expensive available. Many had been passed down from his father and grandfather, their wooden handles worn smooth by decades of use. Some he had made himself when he couldn't afford to buy what he needed. Others had been gifts from grateful customers or fellow craftsmen. Each tool carried memories and had its own character, its own perfect purpose in his work. The carpenter took exceptional care of these tools.